Good morning, everybody. Pastor Rick here with Broadman Baptist Church. This is the Broadman Word for 10 May 2021. What a marvelous day to be a Christian. It's bright and shiny outside. Looks like we're going to have some at least okay temperatures, and all things are well. I hope you're living well in the Lord. And I want to talk to you today about being a learner or being a follower. That's the title of today's Broadman Word, and it's out of the devotional Radical Wisdom. And so, if you take a look around, you're going to find followers of Jesus. It's harder and harder, but they're out there. And the Bible calls these folks disciples. And there are a couple of different categories of disciples, and I think maybe there should just be one, but right now we have learners and we have followers. So let's first examine the learner group. These are the folks that you see taking notes in church. You know, they read their Bible and some devotionals. They get information about Jesus from the church and from other sources. They listen to podcasts. They listen to Christian radio. They go to Christian events. They probably have a TV preacher or two they listen to outside of their regular church. They show up in church pretty much all the time. And to look at these folks, you'd think, well, these people really get it. This is what Christianity is about. This is how you're supposed to live. And there's certainly nothing wrong with any of those activities. But I want to introduce you to some other folks that might shed a slightly different light on just being a learner. And they're called the followers. They're a little bit different. The followers start off with learning for sure, but then they do something different. They actually try to live out what they've learned. There is an application portion to what they've learned. There is an outward application of what they've learned. They try to live out their faith like Jesus told them to. And they try to model Jesus in their life, and they try to walk with Jesus. And so their faith then is not an internal faith. It is certainly something they have inside, but that's not where it stays. They take what they have learned and they let it go out into the kingdom, out into the world, to try to make application of it and see some return on what's been put into them. The learning that's been poured into them gets poured out of them. One more time. The learning that gets poured into them gets poured out of them and on to others who need it. And so there is then the exercise of ministry, an exercise of their individual calling. There is an application of the gospel. And so the church probably needs more followers, people who start with learning, but then are able to take that learning and make application. It's a difference between being a learner and being a follower. Learners are great folks, but it is way too easy just to become this gigantic reservoir of Christian learning and information, to become sort of a sponge to soak it all up. The difficulty with the sponge soaking all up everything it's exposed to is that unless it's squeezed, none of it ever comes back out. It will just stay there and then perhaps evaporate over time, but there's no benefit to that. So what we want is people who can soak up Christian learning, but then are willing to be uncomfortable enough to be squeezed and let that learning be poured out onto others who need it. For years, preachers will pour themselves and all they are and the resources of the church into learners, authors, conference speakers, small group leaders, Sunday school teachers. They all pour and pour and pour into this gigantic reservoir that we call a learner. But the big question is, when does it get poured out to do some good? And so I would encourage you then to be a Jesus follower and start pouring out what's been poured into you. Luke 6:45, for the mouth speaks what the heart is full of. So perhaps it's time to start speaking what's been poured into your heart over all these years. Move yourself from being a reservoir to being a river. Move from being a learner to being a follower. Being in a position where it all starts with a simple yes, to making yourself available to people who are less mature or maybe not exposed to the gospel at all, and then pouring out what you've brought in the same way it was brought into you, but only on to other people. Use your life and your faith as a declaration and a confession of the love of God in your life, the effect of having a relationship with Jesus Christ. Don't keep that in. Pour it out daily and frequently, and make sure that there's no doubt from anyone in your sphere of contact what the love of Christ has done in your life. Be a living declaration and a living confession of that by pouring out what has been poured into you from the moment you first professed and you received grace and salvation and the Holy Spirit, to all the times that you've been in church and learned something and everything in between. Be a follower, which means you've made application of all those things. Say no to things that will restrict you from being a follower, and say yes to the things that will squeeze you like a sponge and let all of that knowledge come out and do some good. So the big question is, learner or follower? I bet you want to be a follower, so let's get about it. Love you. We'll see you next time.